Good evening, everyone. It's good to see everyone out this evening. We're thankful that you've joined us for our evening Bible class, especially if you're visiting with us. We're thankful that you're here. We are going to start by singing the first and third verses of number 425, Master, the Tempest is Raging, and then Andy will teach us here in the auditorium class this evening. Master, the tempest is raging, our billows are tossing high. The sky is o'ershadowed with blackness, no shelter or help is nigh. Carest thou not that we perish? How canst thou lie asleep? When each moment so madly is threatening, our great and the angry deep. Go winds and go waves shall obey thy will. Peace be still. Whether the wrath of the storm shall see, or demons or men or whatever it be, no water can swallow the ship we're lost. The master of ocean and earth and skies, they all shall sweetly obey thy will. Peace be still, peace be still. They all shall sweetly obey thy will. Peace be still. Master, the terror is over, the elements sweetly rise. Earth's sun and calm make his mirror, and heavens within the grass. Linger, O blessed Redeemer, leave me alone no more. And with joy I shall make a blessed harbor, and rest on the blissful shore. The winds and the waves shall obey thy will. Peace be still. Whether the wrath of the storm tossed sea, or demons or men or whatever it be, no water can swallow the ship we're lost. So master of ocean and earth and skies, they all shall sweetly obey thy will. Peace be still, peace be still. They all shall sweetly obey thy will. Peace be still.
Good evening. Hey, it works. You just got to get the right AV guy. Thanks, Chris. All right. So, we've got some media there too. This is our series on Egypt, Jordan, and Israel. So we've already had folks tell us about Egypt, where we arrived there in the pyramids and the Sinai Peninsula, and then we moved on into Jordan. And Jordan, we went to places like Petra and some other places there in Jordan. And then we had the Christmas break, and we're starting the new year into Israel. So this is the beginning of Israel. We're going to be talking tonight about Tiberias, the Sea of Galilee, Capernaum, and Magdala. I'm going to be your travel log guide tonight. Whenever I was young, we used to go to travel logs. I don't know if that's a thing anymore. I guess Rick Steves sort of stole that away, but we would go on a Friday night and we would have just travel pictures where it would be narrated. And this promises to be every bit as exciting as one of those. All right. Well, let's see if I can make this work. Yep, I'm gonna need an AV guy to help me out here. Okay, Trampus, I'm gonna ask you if you would advance the screen there for me. All right, fantastic. Maybe the next time it'll work for me. All right, so on this screen we've got a map. I love maps. When Paul, our brother Paul, talks about maps, I just eat it up. I love maps. When GPSs came along, I thought they were great things too, because I love maps. But this gives us an idea of the area that we're going to take a look at tonight. So we're going to have 4 stops along our way. We're going to start out there at Tiberias, you can see, which is the southernmost of our stops tonight. And then we're going to travel north along the coast of the Sea of Galilee. And we're going to go on the Sea of Galilee. And then we're going to stop at Magdala and move on to Capernaum there in the north. Notice that this is an area that is called Galilee, not only the Sea of Galilee, but also Galilee. This whole area to the north and the west is considered Galilee. Of course, Jordan is to the east there, to the right, so to speak, and that's where we came out of, but I believe we crossed the Jordan River where it wasn't so wide, because it's interesting that the Sea of Galilee is like 7 miles wide. And so that would be a very long bridge or a very long ford, or in the case of the children of Israel, the parting of the waters, it would be more equivalent to, I think, the Red Sea than the parting of the waters of the Jordan, which of course he did as well. All right, let's give this a try. Hey, we're working. Stop number 1 is going to be Tiberias. Now, the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia says that Tiberias was built where there was a village of Rakat, and that actually is referenced in the Old Testament, Joshua chapter 19, verse 35. Where it says, the 6th lot came out of the children of Naphtali, for the children of Naphtali according to their families. And their border began at Heleph, and so forth and so on, until it gets down to verse 35, where it says, and the fortified cities are Zinnim, Zer, Hamath, Rakkath, and Chinnereth. Okay, so Tiberias is regarded by the Jews as a holy city. They have about 4 of them, and Tiberias is considered one of those 4 of the holy cities. It's got a rich history, but it only goes back to about Bible times. As a matter of fact, I'm not even sure that it was there when Jesus was born, because I believe it was built during the time Jesus was doing his ministry, or shortly before his ministry. We understand from like the encyclopedia and also from other sources that it's about 20 AD, or they use the term CE, current era. Well, if it was built about that time, then of course remembering that AD is in the year of our Lord, and it's referenced in Jesus' travels, which we will find, it's referenced some 12 times, I believe. So we're going to see each time that it is referenced. But first of all, we have this reference from the Old Testament. Now, it was a strategically important location on the western shore there of the Sea of Galilee. It's on a major trade route between Syria and Egypt, and it has hot springs. Yep, just like Arkansas. It's got hot springs, and that was quite a draw to bring people to those mineral springs, the hot springs there. It was named Tiberias because of the Emperor Tiberius. The Emperor Tiberius was of course emperor during that particular time. I'm going to have another reference to him a little bit later, you'll see, but it was named because these guys who built these cities, they want to look really good. And if they give you a namesake, I don't know, it's like, what is that? Will you be my godfather of my city? And they're naming their cities after him, and that gives them in good graces with the emperor. So this particular city, though, was built by King Herod's son, Herod Antipas. And he, of course, named it for the Roman Emperor, the Caesar Tiberius. All right. By the way, it's referenced in John 21:1. After these things, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples at the Sea of Tiberias. By the way, where is this Sea of Tiberias? We saw it right back here. You only see one sea, and we're going to discover that many things had multiple names. Not that we would understand that. You know, Murfreesboro Road, US 41, or Lebanon Road. Things have multiple names, I guess, depending on where you are. So when you were in Tiberias, you considered that your sea. And so they called it the Sea of Tiberias. In a trip to Israel, we stayed in a Ron Beach hotel, and it was on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, or also the Sea of Tiberias. And it was a Friday evening, and that was the beginning of the Sabbath. From the balcony, which you can see here, that's, yes, me reclining there in the room, so very comfortably. But from that balcony, you can see on the left-hand side, you can look out, and you can see there's sort of a pathway down to the sea, and you can see, of course, the Sea of Galilee. One of the things that was interesting is, I mentioned it was the Sabbath. Perhaps we could see, I know that we could see several practicing, maybe they were Orthodox Jews or something like that, but they were descending into the water to take a dip or a bath in that water. The surprising thing for us was that they would undress and rush naked into the water to perform their ritual. I'm not sure where that comes from, but that was the sights that we got to see from our balcony. I told you I was going to have a reference to Tiberias. Well, this picture is from the western part of Israel. So now we're over on the coast, the Mediterranean Sea, and that is the Mediterranean Sea that you see there. I'm just mentioning it because also it's mentioned Tiberias. It's current, approximately same time. This one, however, was built, this particular building was built by Pontius Pilate. And he, of course, names it after Tiberius as well, wanting to be in the good graces of Tiberius. Okay, let's move on now to our next stop. And our next stop is the Sea of Galilee. As a matter of fact, we accessed the Sea of Galilee from Tiberias. And I'll tell about that in a minute. The Lake of Gennesaret in northern Israel is the largest body of fresh water in Israel. And it supplies fresh water not only to Israel, but to neighboring countries such as Jordan. The Lake of Gennesaret lies about 700 feet below sea level. Wow, I don't even know how that works. Seems like if it's below sea level, water would keep pouring in until it would be sea level. But it's 700 feet below sea level. It's the world's lowest freshwater lake and the second lowest lake after the Dead Sea. It's named after the ancient town of Gennesaret. You can see there that ancient town of Gennesaret, which is between Magdala and Capernaum. But it's also called the Sea of Chinnereth, or the Sea of Tiberias, and of course the Sea of Galilee, which is the most common one that we know. The Old Testament is where it was named the Sea of Chinnereth. It's referenced in Numbers chapter 34, verse 11, and Deuteronomy chapter 3, verse 17, where it talks about the Sea of Chinnereth. All right, well, let's move on and let's talk about what happened here at the Sea of Galilee? Why is it important to us? Jesus was walking by the Sea of Galilee. So that's something that we understand is on the Sea of Galilee, the shores of the Sea of Galilee. That was one of the most wonderful things, was being able to be on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. And I know, just like that poem about the footprints, they've been washed away. But his footprints were there on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. So we read about Jesus walking on the shores there in Matthew chapter 4 and also in chapter 15. So Jesus walked on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. Also, Master, the tempest is raging. Where the song comes from. What sea was it? It was the Sea of Galilee. Which is why I asked to sing that song. His disciples came and awoke him. Lord, save us. We are perishing. Well, also nearby, well, let's talk about the size. Let's talk about the size of the Sea of Galilee. Well, you know, Percy Priest, we're all familiar with that. That Percy Priest Lake is about 1/3 the size. The Sea of Galilee is about 3 times the size of Percy Priest Lake. And that's taken by area. If you take a look, surface area of the waters, then the Sea of Galilee is about 3 times the size of Percy Priest. We're going to look a little bit further here and do some other comparisons just to try to get a handle on what size it is. It's actually closest to Pickwick Lake, and we'll see that in just a minute. What else did Jesus do on the shores or on the Sea of Galilee? Well, he preached nearby. The Sermon on the Mount, and several other things where he preached, other cities where he preached, but the Sermon on the Mount, it has a traditional location that we'll see shortly, and Jesus preached there. So that was nearby the Sea of Galilee. He also, if you notice there in Luke chapter 5, verses 1 through 3, there was a time whenever he backed out to the shoreline and then got into a boat and floated out a little bit, I suppose, and preached from the boat to the people that were on the shore. Another thing, what about that miraculous catch of fish? There in Luke chapter 5, verses 4 through 11. You remember those stories, right? Where Jesus said, cast your nets on the other side. And they cast their nets, and they were so overwhelmed with the number of fish that they started sinking. And they knew it must be the Lord. You know, it's not the first or the last time that they're going to have their faith tested, and they're going to have a demonstration, a miraculous demonstration of the Lord's power over the Sea of Galilee. Well, we took a boat ride on the Sea of Galilee. I told you we left Tiberias and went down to the dock there in Tiberias, and we boarded a boat ride. Well, the photo on the left is from the boat looking back at Tiberias, and that's my sweet wife there in the foreground. On the right-hand side, we sang some songs together. Of course, one of them was Master, the Tempest is Raging. Fortunately, the tempest did not rage, but you can see we're all dressed pretty warmly since it was a cool evening in February on that water. Coming back to the size of the lake. The lake has a surface area of 64 square miles. Its maximum depth, it's measured in the northeast, is 157 feet and extends 13 miles from north to south and 7 miles from east to west. And you can see in that picture, it's kind of pear-shaped. Its surface elevation was given at 686 feet, I already said it was 700, which is 209 meters. Now I want you to look at this thing that I took a picture of. This sits on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. And on it is a digital numbering. Hopefully you can see. Yeah, it's hard to see, but we'll, this right here, digital numbers, right there it says 213. Now that's in meters, and those of you who know immediately how to convert from metric to feet and feet to metric, you'll get that. But at 213 meters, it actually is a little bit higher than the traditional 209 meters. Perhaps because it had been raining that day. Seriously, I don't think it came up 4 meters because of one rainy day. But this water surveyor constantly shows the current depth, or the depth in relationship to this sea level. And there we have a few of our ladies posing in front of the Sea of Galilee. Notice the raincoat. All right, I said that the lake has a surface area of 64 square miles. So how does that compare? I took this from the Wikipedia. I said, hey, just tell me in the United States, what's the ranking of bodies of water? And you can see that the top body of water there, I think, is 78. 78th is the 78th largest is the Pickwick Lake. The next one in Tennessee down there is 89. And this is kind of smack dab in the middle. If it was going to be numbered, it would be like 82 or 83. So that's the size of the Sea of Galilee. All right, it's time for us to leave the Sea of Galilee and move on and go to Magdala. This entire trip is only about 15 miles, 15 kilometers or so, 10 miles, 15 kilometers. It takes about 18 to 20 minutes to go from Tiberias all the way to Capernaum if you're driving in a car. I suspect it took longer back in Bible times. But I also want you to notice on this particular slide, in between Magdala and Capernaum, there is what's considered the traditional location of the Mount of Beatitudes, where the Sermon on the Mount took place. And that's going to become important here in just a minute. All right. So, what do we know about Magdala? Magdala is mentioned a few times in the Bible, and it's but there's some historical things that we can find about it too. A historian, Flavius Josephus, Cicero, and a few others say that the export of salted fish was so successful that Magdala is also known as something that I can't pronounce there, which is Tariche, I guess. It soon became a self-sustaining town. They particularly recommended the fish from Tariche, and it actually ended up becoming kind of a brand name, Terikos, which means salted fish. So they were known pretty well, far and wide, all the way even to Rome. You know, most of the fish that were caught in the Sea of Galilee weren't sold fresh at the market because they caught much more than could be consumed in a single day, so they would want to ship it, so they would salt that fish, some way of preserving it. One of the interesting things is that Christ, in his sermon, talks about salt. And we're going to read that in just a moment, I think. Actually, let's go ahead and, nope, we're going to skip that because I want to tell you something our tour guide told us. But at that Sermon on the Mount that was nearby, let's do this. Let's go ahead and read about the Sermon on the Mount. You are the salt of the earth. Remember this? This starts in Matthew chapter 5, verse 13. You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its flavor, how shall it be seasoned? It's then good for nothing, but to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. Okay, so when we were having our tour there, we had a tour guide. His name was Saeed. And he was very good, very entertaining. We appreciated him a lot. So as we were talking a week or so ago, Roxanne, and I told her I was doing this, I said, we didn't stop at Magdala, right? And she said, no, but he told a story that really made an impact upon her. So she reminded me of Saeed's story. I didn't independently verify this information, but Saeed was our tour guide. He's certified in Israel history, so I have reason to believe that it's probably true. So Roxanne remembered the story like this. As we rode by Magdala on the tour bus, Saeed explained that there were salt mines nearby, and that in Bible times, many of the town's population at Magdala were salt miners. And since Jesus' Sermon on the Mount was also nearby, some of those people from Magdala probably were in attendance at that Sermon on the Mount. And he spoke about the salt, which we just read. And he talks about that the salt, when it loses its savor, it's good for nothing except to be thrown out. Now, these folks would be very familiar with salt, right? Salted fish, mining salt. They would know what bad salt was. They would understand about impurities and how you couldn't use salt whenever it was impure or not good. They would understand the properties. And that's the way Jesus was in his teachings. When he taught in ways that people could understand, that people could relate to. So as he spoke on the Sermon on the Mount, I think about some of those from the town of Magdala understanding. Well, another reference there is Mary Magdalene. Now, you know, Jesus was considered a Nazarene. I don't know what we're called, Murfreesborians or something, Murfreesborians, Tennessean, we understand that. So Mary was probably of Magdala, Mary Magdalene. She was a disciple who, with other women, also traveled with Jesus. You remember she visited the tomb. She told the disciples that she had seen the resurrected Jesus. And those are, some of those verses are Matthew chapter 27, verse 56. Among those were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Joseph, the mother of Zebedee's sons. A little bit later in that same chapter, verse 61, and Mary Magdalene was there, and the other Mary sitting opposite the tomb. And then in 28, verse 1, now after the Sabbath, as the first day of the week began to dawn, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary came to see the tomb. So Mary Magdalene was someone that Jesus knew, someone that Jesus apparently frequented places with, or she came along as a disciple following Jesus. Now, we learn a little bit more about Mary Magdalene when we go to Luke chapter 8, verse 2, where it says, and certain women who had been healed of evil spirits and infirmities, for example, Mary called Magdalene, out of whom had come 7 demons. And then later in Luke chapter 24, verse 10, it was Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Mary the mother of James and other women that were with them, which told these things unto the apostles. This is after they have seen the risen Jesus, and they meet the apostles on the road, and they're telling them something that the apostles can't possibly believe that Jesus is resurrected. And yet these women, Mary being one of them, are telling Jesus about this. Another reference for Mary Magdalene, well, actually, there are about 12. There are about 12 references of Mary Magdalene. But there's also plenty of speculation. I read on the internet, I had a couple of internet sites where they were really capitalizing or commercializing, it seemed like, Mary Magdalene and building up a whole lot around this particular city. So there's plenty of speculation and storytelling around the significance of Magdala and Mary Magdalene, and you can imagine that the city of Magdala itself would participate in that type of thing. One example is an erroneous portrayal as a prostitute, or the prostitute that washed Jesus' feet, where their hair first started in 591 AD by Pope Gregory, who equated her to Mary of Bethany. Okay, we know there was a Mary of Bethany because that was the sister of Lazarus, the sister of Martha. So be careful about equating Mary Magdalene there. Some fiction even portrays her as the wife of Jesus. Don't believe these stories. Mary Magdalene was someone who was a follower of Jesus. She was someone out of whom was cast 7 demons. She was someone who went to the tomb. She was someone who saw the resurrected Jesus. Well, that's our story about Magdala. It's time to move on to Capernaum. So Capernaum is mentioned a bunch of times. I saw one reference that said 16. I saw another reference that said 30. I think that might be conflating it a little bit. It kind of served as Jesus' headquarters, or at least there are a lot of stories that take place in Capernaum, a lot of scripture references. So what do we find that happened at Capernaum? When you come into Capernaum, there is this sign. I got to take this sign, this picture. And the tourism industry has made this claim to fame of Capernaum, the town of Jesus. We know that Jesus was born in Bethlehem. We know he was raised in Nazareth. Luke chapter 4, verse 16. Perhaps the thought is that Jesus was not accepted in his hometown. Do you remember that? In that same story is told in 3 Gospels. Luke chapter 4, verse 16 through 24 tells actually mentions Nazareth, and it says, he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up. And as his custom was, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day and stood up to read. And he was handed the book of the prophet Isaiah, and he had opened the book. He found the place where it is written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to proclaim the liberty of the captives." This verse is fulfilled in your hearing. Well, the people, when they heard that, they thought, wow. And they go on to say, so all bore witness to him and marveled at the gracious words which proceeded out of his mouth. And they said, isn't this Joseph's son? Joseph's little boy? He said to them, you will surely say this proverb to me, physician, heal yourself. Whatever we have heard done in Capernaum, which we're at now, on our stop number 4, do also here in your own country. Prove it. Then he said, "Assuredly, I say to you, no prophet is accepted in his own country." Perhaps they put this sign outside of Capernaum because they think Jesus wasn't accepted in Nazareth, so he kind of went and lived around in Capernaum. Well, it's certainly true that Jesus spent time there in Capernaum, perhaps because many of his apostles were from Capernaum and his disciples were from here or close by. Although John chapter 1 verse 44 tells us that Philip was of Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter, there are three gospel accounts: Matthew chapter 8 starting at verse 5, Mark chapter 1 starting at verse 21, and Luke chapter 4 starting at verse 31, and they tell us that Peter's house was in Capernaum. So Peter, for those who might be wondering about that bell, now's the time. If you need to take the Lord's Supper, you can pass down the hallway to 105. Thank you. And you'll be served there. Tells that Peter's house was in it was in Capernaum, and his mother-in-law was healed when Jesus traveled to Capernaum. Perhaps they moved a few steps to Capernaum. Perhaps Bethsaida was to Capernaum what Walter Hill is to Murfreesboro. When somebody asks me where I live, if I'm talking to a Murfreesborian, I might say Walter Hill. If I'm talking to a Tennessean, I would say Murfreesboro. If I'm talking to someone somewhere else, I'd probably say Murfreesboro. Perhaps Bethsaida was too small of a blip to be where they're from. Like Magdala, though, this village is also a fishing village. Remember that the occupation of many of Jesus' apostles were fishermen. You know, some people conclude from the verse Mark chapter 2, verse 1, which says, "And he returned," this talking about Jesus, "and he returned to Capernaum after some days. It was reported that he was at home." That's the ESV version. The New King James says, "in the house." So perhaps, I think it may be a little bit of a stretch to say that this is now his hometown or it is the town of Jesus, but he certainly spent a lot of time there. All right, let's talk about what's in Capernaum. So what did he do? He taught at the synagogue on the Sabbaths, and he cast out evil spirits. He healed the servant of a centurion. He healed Peter's mother-in-law. You remember the story about the temple tax? When he comes into Capernaum, aren't you going to pay the temple tax? Or is your master exempt? And he says, "Go fish." And he finds a way to pay it. And then the story about who is the greatest. So we'll do many of these as we have a time to do. So in Luke chapter 4, verse 31 through 37, "Then he went down to Capernaum, the city of Galilee, and was teaching them on the Sabbath. And they were astonished at his teaching, for his word was with authority. Now in the synagogue there was a man who had a spirit of an unclean demon, and he cried out with a loud voice, saying, 'Let us alone! What have we to do with you, Jesus of Nazareth? Did you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God.' But Jesus rebuked him, saying, 'Be quiet, and come out of him.' And when the demon had thrown him in their midst, it came out of him, did not hurt him. Then they were all amazed and spoke among themselves, saying, 'What a word this is! For with authority and power he commands the unclean spirits, and they come out.' And the report about him went out in every place in the surrounding region." Well, that was the casting out evil spirits. let's also learn about the centurion's servant. That's Luke chapter 7, verse 1 through 10. Now, when he concluded all his sayings in the hearing of the people, he entered Capernaum. And a certain centurion servant who was dear to him was sick and ready to die. So when he heard about Jesus, he sent elders to the Jews to him, pleading with him to come and heal his servant. And when they came to Jesus, they begged him earnestly, saying that the one for whom he should do this was deserving, for he loves our nation, and he has built us a synagogue. We'll see a synagogue in just a minute. Then Jesus went with them, and when he was already not far from the house, the centurion sent friends to him, saying to him, Lord, do not trouble yourself, for I am not worthy that you should enter under my roof. Therefore, I did not even think myself worthy to come to you, but say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I am also a man placed under authority, and those who were sent, returning to the house, found the servant. I feel like we skipped to something there. Because Jesus, maybe it was in another verse, it says, Jesus marveled at the man's faith. But as they returned back to the house, they found the servant well who had been sick. Jesus had healed the servant. There's a real short one about healing Peter's mother-in-law, Matthew chapter 8, verse 14 through 15. Now when Jesus had come into Peter's house, he saw his wife's mother lying sick with a fever. So he touched her hand, and the fever left her. In this next scripture, we jump to chapter 17. Okay, so we were in chapter 8, now we're in chapter 17. I conclude from that this is not exactly the same time. It's another time that Jesus went back and visited Capernaum. But in Matthew chapter 17, verses 24 through 27, when they had come to Capernaum, those who received the temple tax came to Peter and said, Does your teacher not pay the temple tax? He said, Yes. And when he had come into the house, Jesus anticipated him, saying, What do you think, Simon? From whom do the kings of the earth take customs or taxes, from their sons or from strangers? Peter said to him, From strangers. Jesus said to him, Then the sons are free. Nevertheless, lest we offend them, go to the sea, cast in a hook, and take the fish that comes up first. And when you have opened its mouth, you will find a piece of money. And that's how they paid the temple tax. Well, I have just a couple of pictures left. I think when are we actually supposed to end? Okay. Thank you. All right, now comes the real test. This was a video that I took, and I hope it works. Let's find out. This is the remains of a synagogue, recalling that the centurion built a synagogue. Maybe this one, probably not this exact one, but probably on the same site. But these are ruins from a synagogue. Now notice here, on the left we have the youngers at the synagogue, and on the right we have the elders. If you're having trouble seeing who that is, that's Roxanne and I, we're the youngers. And the elders are Randall and Bob. They're at the synagogue. What about that house of Peter's? How do they even go about determining whether this was the house of Peter's? I'd say it's really, really hard. But in the Byzantine period, they would send out and try to find sites so that they could be venerated, so that they could build churches on top of them. And by listening to local verbal history and local legend and talking to the people, they came upon this particular octagonal foundation. And then they built a church on top of it. So on the right-hand side, what you see is the glass floor of the church building that was built over this alleged house of Peter in Capernaum. And Trampas, I need a little help moving forward. This is the outside of that. So the foundations that you see there are just houses and housing. And then the arrow is pointing underneath that building, that octagonal building, where the floor had glass in it and had the house of Peter underneath it. But this was my favorite current day resident of Capernaum that I saw there. All right, that brings us to a close. Thank you very much.